The lecture hall at the University of Chicago was packed. Every seat taken, every stairwell filled. The kind of crowd you only see when something controversial is expected to unfold. Students whispered. Reporters snapped photos. Flashbulbs lit up the room like fireflies caught in a storm. The topic? Education and politics in the 21st century. But the real reason for the buzz wasn't the topic. It was the trap. I knew exactly why I was invited. I slipped in quietly, wearing a cream-colored suit and low heels. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I wasn't here to win anyone over. I just wanted to listen. So I took the last seat in the back row. But that wasn't going to be enough to stay invisible. Not today. Not when Dr. Richard Williams was standing at the front of the room, waiting for me. Voice intensifies slightly, edge of steel in her words. Williams was a legend in the math world, a tenured professor with decades of experience, dozens of publications, and a glare sharp enough to pierce through steel. But to me, he was something else. He was the type of academic who believed people like me didn't belong here. To him, I wasn't a thinker. I was a product, a face, a prop for the political machine. He didn't see my experience. He didn't care about the years I'd spent breaking down data sets, decoding polling trends, and building strategies that flipped entire counties. To him, I was just lucky, just decorative. And he was about to make sure everyone else in that room saw me the same way. Dramatic pause. Then, his voice, mimicked with a subtle mocking tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we begin our discussion today, we have a special guest in the audience." His eyes found me instantly, a predator locking onto prey. "Please welcome Miss Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary." The crowd turned. I felt the air thicken as all eyes landed on me. He wasn't just introducing me. He was placing me on a pedestal to tear me down. "She's been called a genius in many fields," Williams continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But today, I want to see if that reputation holds up in my world." Beat. Music swells in background. The chalk hits the board. He turned to the blackboard and began writing. Lines, symbols, brackets, integrals nested within integrals. By the time he finished, the board was full, an advanced calculus problem so convoluted it looked more like ancient scripture than mathematics. "This problem," he said, turning back to the audience, "takes my top students at least 15 minutes to solve, if they don't quit first." Then he looked at me. "Miss Leavitt, care to demonstrate your brilliance?" Quiet intensity. Narration slows down, every word measured. The room fell silent. Could hear nothing but the faint hum of the overhead lights and the quiet collective gasp of anticipation. Someone near me whispered, "There's no way she's going up there." I stood. Not because I had something to prove, but because I was tired. Tired of men like Williams deciding the size of the box they thought I should fit in. I walked slowly to the front of the room. My heels clicked sharply against the floor, each step like a countdown. He watched me approach, arms crossed, a smirk dancing at the corners of his mouth. He thought this was his moment. He had no idea it was about to be mine. Music rises. Voice gets confident but never loud. I picked up the chalk. The problem in front of me was complex. No doubt. But so was running data simulations at 3 a.m. before a national debate. So was managing a press room under fire from all sides. Math was never my weakness. It was my refuge. I took a breath, looked at the board, and started to write. Final line. Soft, confident, cinematic fade-out feel. He wanted to humiliate me. But all I did was pick up the chalk and begin. Opening, steady, composed tone, like someone who knows her. I stood at that blackboard. The entire room holding its breath like a theater just before the curtain rises. A sea of eyes, cameras, notebooks, all waiting to see me fail. Williams leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk watching its prey. But I didn't look at him. I looked at the numbers, because while he was focused on making a statement, I was focused on solving the problem. Watching me like a Kolknetsparmen. The tension builds. We hear chalk against the board. The first thing I did, I scanned the equation, line by line, variable by variable. I knew this game. He wanted me to freeze, to second-guess myself, to prove his theory, that I was nothing more than a pretty face in the wrong room. But I wasn't here to be agreeable. I was here to be undeniable. So I started writing. Voice becomes more deliberate, calculated yet graceful. My chalk moved with precision, methodical, calm, substitution, integration by parts, simplify, restructure, solve. I could feel the temperature in the room change. Whispers stopped. The cameras in the back zoomed in. I didn't rush. I didn't perform. I just solved. And before the 2-minute mark had even passed, I set the chalk down. Then I turned around to face the room. Beat. Let the silence breathe. Then, not a sound. Even the skeptics in the front row were stunned. One girl slowly lowered her phone, jaw slack. Another guy mouthed, "No way." I didn't need to say a word. The math spoke for itself. Now we shift to Williams. Voice sharpens, shifts in tone. Dr. Williams stood up slowly, like a man watching the walls around him begin to crack. He walked to the board and hovered his hand over each line I'd written, looking for a mistake, a miscalculation, anything. But he didn't find one. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened. I could see it the exact moment the doubt crept in. He didn't expect me to get it right. And he sure as hell didn't expect me to hit Faster's best students ever had. But instead of admitting it, he smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Tone turned slightly colder, building the next challenge. "Well done," he said, his voice low and clipped. But that was just a warm-up. He turned back to the board. New symbols, longer equations, complex integrals nested inside irrational functions. This one wasn't just challenging. It was brutal. When he finished writing, he stepped aside and said, "This is the real test." Now back to Karoline. Pause, introspection before resolve. I stared at the board, and for the first time, I hesitated. It was an ambush, and I knew it. Designed not just to test my ability, but to overwhelm me. Somewhere behind me, I heard a student whisper, "She's not going to solve that." Part of me wanted to sit back down. Let the moment end while I was still ahead. But that's not who I am. I've never walked away from a challenge just because it was designed to break me. Now the shift, resolve, rising energy, powerful tone. So I stepped forward. I picked up the chalk again, and without saying a word, I faced the storm head on. Let him throw his hardest problem. Let him stack the deck. Because this wasn't just about equations anymore. This was about every woman who's ever been told she was in over her head. Every student who was told to sit down, shut up, and stay in their lane. Every underestimated mind in a room built to intimidate. Closing line. Slow, confident, cinematic delivery. I didn't come here to win his approval. I came to show him. You don't measure genius by how loud you are. You measure it by who keeps standing when the room dares them not to. Opening, tension building, breath tight, voice steady but honest. I was halfway through the second problem, and then it happened. My hand froze. The numbers stopped making sense. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because the deeper I went into the problem, the more I realized this wasn't just a hard equation. It was a maze, a trap. Something designed not to be solved, but to break whoever dared to try. Whispers rise in the room. She hears them all. The murmurs started behind me. She's stuck. She's bluffing. Knew she wasn't that smart. Even the laughter, low and smug. And then Williams. "Oh, Miss Leavitt," he said, just loud enough for the room to hear. "You're discovering that brilliance on television doesn't always translate into brilliance on the board." The words cut deep, sharper than any chalk line. But I didn't flinch, because what I felt wasn't shame. It was clarity. Beat, then shift, becomes quiet but burning. He wanted me isolated, alone, just like so many teachers do when they turn learning into performance. But the thing is, I didn't come here to perform. I came here to learn, to grow, to lead. And suddenly, I realized something. Maybe this problem wasn't meant to be solved by one person. Maybe that's the point. Now her tone shifts, strong, inviting, uplifting. So I turned around. I looked at the room, at the dozens of students sitting silently, watching me fail, and I asked them a simple question. Why are we acting like this is a performance when it could be a collaboration? The room went still, not because it was a radical idea, but because no one had ever asked them that before. The spark, she ignites the room. I smiled. Math isn't about ego, I said. It's about patterns, about perspective, about solving the world together. Then I pointed to the board and asked, anyone have an idea? It took a moment, just one. Then a girl in glasses raised her hand, timidly. I think we could try isolating the variables first, I nodded. Let's try it. And just like that, it began. Music rises. Momentum builds. Her tone becomes electric. One by one, students began speaking up. A guy in the third row suggested substitution. Someone else offered to simplify the nested function. A voice from the back shouted, we could use second-order derivation here. And I just kept going. Coaching, guiding, connecting the pieces. I wasn't just solving a problem anymore. I was building a bridge, from silence to speech, from fear to curiosity, from a classroom to a movement. Visual, the board fills up, her voice steady like a conductor's baton. Lines of chalk started to form something new, not just an answer, a process, a shared rhythm. And when we finally finished, when we reached that solution, it wasn't my victory, it was ours. Beat, the room erupts, energy, freedom, joy. The room exploded in applause, laughter, cheering, high fives across rows. Students were standing, beaming, recording with their phones. They weren't just proud of the answer. They were proud of themselves, proud of what they'd become in the last 10 minutes. Final moment. Quiet, cinematic. I turned to Williams. He hadn't moved, still leaning against the desk, but something was different. His arms weren't crossed anymore, and his eyes, for the first time, they weren't filled with skepticism. They were filled with something else, respect. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. Because for the first time since I walked into that room, I wasn't the one on trial. The system was opening, voice calm but firm. Tension builds immediately. It should have been a victory. The second problem was solved. The room was alive, students cheering, ideas flying, a breakthrough unlike anything that lecture hall had seen in years. But not everyone was clapping. In the corner of the room, slouched back in his chair, was a student with messy hair and a smirk too big for the silence that followed. His name was Roth, and his voice cut through the celebration like a blade. Voice shifts, mocking tone to quote him. She knew the problem ahead of time. A hush fell instantly. You could feel the air freeze. Just like that, the energy shifted from inspiration to suspicion. She probably had the problem emailed to her, Roth added. That's how she solved it so fast. Pause. Her inner reaction. Voice stays controlled. I didn't flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because I'd heard this kind of thing my whole life. If she's that good, she must be cheating. If she's that confident, she must be fake. If she's that young, that smart, and that female, she must have had help. The sad part? It wasn't just him. I felt the doubt ripple across the room. The eyes, the whispers. Even Williams, he didn't say a word. Tone shifts. Cold steel. So I turned to Roth, and I asked him the simplest question I could think of. Do you want to take my place? He blinked. What? I pointed at the board. If you think I had the answer ahead of time, step up. Solve the next one. Roth shifted in his seat, fumbled with his pen, mouth slightly open, but no words came out. Come on, I said. You've got theories. Let's see if you've got math. He didn't move. I didn't have to say anything else. The silence said enough. William stepped forward. Now the real test begins. Voice deepens. Intensity builds. William stepped forward. He picked up a fresh piece of chalk, his movements slower this time, more calculated. He began writing the third problem. And this wasn't just any problem. This was a trap, a nonlinear equation nested in recursive derivatives with a false lead buried right in the center. A minefield, a mathematical ambush. He set the chalk down with a click. If you solve this, he said quietly, then I'll believe you. Now it's on. Inner doubt meets outer courage. I stared at the board. It was brutal, dense. It didn't want to be solved. It wanted to mislead. And for a moment, just a moment, I could feel the hesitation creeping in. Maybe this was too far. Maybe this was the one I'd get wrong. And then I remembered Roth's voice. Not his words, his tone. That smug certainty that people like me can't be real. And I felt the fire return. She attacks the problem. Voice turns fast, calculated, precise. I picked up the chalk. Started breaking the problem apart. Line by line. term by term. I ignored the obvious route. It was bait. Instead, I flipped the structure, approached from the side, variable isolation, matrix simplification, linear transformation. My brain was in overdrive, but my hand was steady. But then, another twist. She hits the wall. Halfway through, I stopped. Something didn't feel right. I stared at the page, and suddenly, I saw it. The loop. A deliberate loop. One that fed itself back into the same function, over and over like a trapdoor. It was elegant. It was cruel. And it was designed for me to fall in. Beat. Her tone shifts again. Quiet strength. So I stopped thinking like a student, and I started thinking like a strategist. What if this wasn't just an equation? What if it was a message, a challenge not to outcalculate, but to outthink? So I changed the approach entirely. I restructured the equation into a system of matrices, applied a linear transformation that flipped the recursive logic inside out, shifted the frame from derivative-based to vector field flow. It was bold, risky, and it worked. Final moment power, clarity, cinematic quiet. 3 minutes later, I set the chalk down. On the board, clean, clear, perfect, was the solution. No gaps, no shortcuts, no tricks. Just the truth written in chalk. I turned around, and this time, the room didn't whisper. It roared. Closing lines, full circle moment. Roth didn't say a word. He just stared at the board, mouth half open, face flushed. And Williams? He stepped forward slowly. His eyes scanned the solution, line by line, term by term, no errors, no shortcuts. Finally, in a voice so quiet only I could hear it, he said, "You really are a genius." I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just looked him in the eye and said, "I didn't come here to impress you. I came here to tell the truth." Opening, quiet, reflective tone. The storm has passed, but something lingers. The classroom was empty, chairs half turned, chalk dust still floating in the air. The echo of applause was long gone, but the feeling still pulsing in my chest. I was alone, or so I thought. Karoline. His voice came from the hallway, low, unfamiliar, almost human. I turned. Dr. Williams stood there, not with the cold, intimidating posture he always wore like armor, but something different, something softer. The hallway is place for truth, not performance. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said, stepping closer. I shrugged. I don't leave things unfinished. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from a place buried deep in his past, he said, "I was wrong about you." Let the silence breathe. Then, honesty cuts through. "I used to believe," he continued, "that the only way to keep students sharp was to make them fear failure. That fear would make them stronger. But somewhere along the way," he admitted, "I forgot why I started teaching at all." Karoline's voice reflects empathy, not pity, but connection. I didn't say anything at first, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood. We've all worn masks to survive the systems we didn't create, but sometimes we wear them for so long we forget who we were without them. So I looked him in the eye and said, "Fear can keep people in line, but it never makes them reach higher." Beat Williams looks away, processing. "I watched you today," he said, "not just solve problems, but awaken something in that room I hadn't seen in years." He turned to the window, voice quiet. They weren't afraid of the board anymore. They were hungry for it. And now, the offer. Then he turned back to me. "Karoline, have you ever considered teaching?" I blinked. That I didn't expect. "Wait, you want me to?" "Come back," he said, "as a guest lecturer, as a mentor, as whatever you want to be. I think they need someone like you." Her voice softens. She's caught off guard, but she's listening. Part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to cry. After everything, the judgment, the challenge, the accusation, he was inviting me into his world, not as a guest, but as an equal. Still, she hesitates because it matters. "I'm not sure I belong here," I said honestly. Williams smiled, genuinely, for the first time. "That's what I thought about you, and you proved me wrong." Now the music begins to swell. This is not just a character arc, it's a generational shift. I didn't give him an answer that day, not with words, but when I reached for the door the next morning, the door to that same classroom, the same chalkboard, the same eyes waiting to see who would lead them, I didn't walk in as a guest. I walked in as a guide. Final line, voice strong, soft, and soaring. He tried to break me, but instead, I broke the cycle. Opening, warm tone, reflective, proud yet grounded. 3 months. It had only been 3 months, but when I stepped back into that lecture hall, it didn't feel like the same room. The cold tension that used to hang in the air? Gone. The fear in students' eyes? Gone. Instead, I saw smiles. I heard laughter, and I felt something I never thought I'd feel in a math class again. Joy. She walks through a changed space. Her voice slows with meaning. Desks were still lined up in perfect rows. Chalkboards still covered in symbols. But now there were Post-it notes with scribbles of ideas. Whiteboards with half-solved problems waiting for anyone brave enough to jump in. And at the front of the room was me. Not as a guest. Not as a challenge. Not as a spectacle. But as a teacher. She begins class, her voice now calm, steady. "All right," I said, turning to the board. "Let's play." I didn't say test. I didn't say lecture. I said play, because math isn't punishment, it's possibility. And these students, they were starting to believe it too. We see growth, Roth Emma. They've changed too. Roth, the same student who once accused me of cheating, he now sat in the front row. Notebook open, focused, engaged, curious. The first time he raised his hand to explain a solution, the whole class paused, but he did it flawlessly. And Emma, the shy girl in glasses who used to shrink into her seat, she now ran a tutoring circle outside of class. She had become a leader in the way no one saw coming, except maybe me. William steps back, pride in his eyes, a baton passed quietly. And then there was Dr. Williams. He no longer loomed from the front of the class like a gatekeeper. Instead, he sat in the back, arms relaxed, eyes soft, observing, not policing. For the first time in a long time, he was watching students learn, not just survive. And when our eyes met across the room, he didn't nod with approval. He smiled with pride. A simple moment, a snapshot of change, becomes iconic. On the last day of the semester, Roth stood up and said, "Can we take a picture? You know, to remember this." I laughed. "Are you sure you want me in it?" He looked at me like it wasn't even a question. "You're the reason this class is what it is." So we all gathered. Emma on my left, Roth on my right, Dr. Williams off to the side, arms crossed, but smiling. Final line of the moment, full circle. The camera clicked, and in that single frame, I wasn't a student anymore. I wasn't a politician. I was a teacher. Closing message, soft, powerful, leaving echoes. Some people solve equations. Some solve puzzles. But if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to believe in something bigger than yourself, you don't just solve problems, you solve people. You solve mindsets. And when that happens, you don't just leave the classroom changed, you leave the whole world different.